We are on page Kuf Lamed Gimel Amid Aleph. We're on the fourth line at the two dots. Omar Mar. Now, remember, we're talking about Bris Milah. We're talking about how the fact that Bris Milah is doche other mitzvahs. The two other mitzvahs that we've been discussing are Shabbos and Tsaras. And that even though you're not allowed to remove Tsaras off of the body using some kind of cutting instrument, nevertheless, if you have to do a bris and there's a lesion on the foreskin, you still remove it. Amar Mar, Bisar, the pasuk says the word Bisar, which teaches me that Afal Pi Sheyesham Baheres Yimol Diva Rabbi Yoshia. That Rabbi Yoshia had said from the word Bisar, we learned that unconditionally you remove the foreskin even when there's a lesion on it. So the Gemara asks a very simple question. Ha lama likra davar she'ein miskavein hu v'davar she'ein miskavein mutter. Why do you need a pasuk to tell me that you're allowed to remove the foreskin with a lesion? After all, isn't this what's known as a davar she'ein miskavein? Something which is a byproduct, which is not the intended objective. Now we know that this is a discussion, a davar she'ein miskavein, whether it's mutter or aser, is a machlokus in the laws of Shabbos between Reb Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says davar she'ein miskavein is aser. Reb Shimon says davar she'ein miskavein is mutter. Here the Gemara is extending that discussion to a non-Shabbos halacha, which is that if I want to do a bris, my objective is to circumcise the child, not to remove the lesion. And if that's the case, then why shouldn't it be permitted, at least according to Reb Shimon, who says that a davar she'ein miskavein is mutter? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi lo nitzrach ela Rabbi Yehuda damar davar she'ein miskavein aser. Abaye says, well, it must be that Rabbi Yoshia, who says that you need a pasuk to permit you to do the bris, is going according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that under normal circumstances, davar she'ein miskavein is aser. And because it's aser, without a pasuk, I wouldn't know that you're allowed to do the circumcision. And therefore comes along the pasuk and says that even though a byproduct of your objective is that you're going to be removing a lesion, it's nevertheless permitted. Rava Amar Afilu Tema Reb Shimon Moda Reb Shimon B'Psik Reishay V'Lo Yamos. Rava disagrees. He says no. Rabbi Yoshia is going according to Reb Shimon as well, because even Reb Shimon would agree that a davar she'ein miskavein, if there's a psik reisha involved, if the unintended objective is automatic, it's going to happen 100% of the time. That's what we call a psik reisha. So then that's no longer called a davar she'ein miskavein, because once you know that every time that you do this, you do act A, outcome B will also accompany it, so then that's not called a davar she'ein miskavein anymore. And therefore Reb Shimon would also agree that that's aser when there's a psik reisha. So the Gemara asks the question, V'abaya leslei haisvar? Why does Abaya argue with Rava? Does Abaya not agree to this principle that when there's a psik reisha that even Reb Shimon agrees that it's aser? V'ha'abaya v'Rava damri to Ravayu moder Reb Shimon v'psik reisha v'lo yamus. Don't we know this statement that both Abaya and Rava agree that when there's a psik reisha involved, that even Reb Shimon holds that it's aser? So Basar Deshama me Rava Savra answers the Gemara after he heard Rava's argument that a psik reisha makes something from a davar she'ein miskavein to a davar hamiskavein. He accepted Rava's principle and he assented to Rava. So Ika Damasni Lahada Ba'i Rava Aha. Some learn that the discussion is not regarding the removal of a lesion at the time of circumcision, but rather some say that this whole discussion between Abai and Rava is going on the following discussion. The pasuk says, "Yishamar benega hatzaras lishmor ma'od v'la'asos." We make a drasha from the following brisa. The brisa uses the pasuk of "Be very careful about the lesion of tsaras, lishmor v'la'asos," to protect it and to do the proper thing. So the brisa learns from the word la'asos, i'ata oseh, aval ata oseh b'siv shal gabe raglo uvamot shal gabe ksefo. The language of the pasuk implies that you're only prohibited from doing a proactive action that is going to remove the lesion. But if you do a passive act, such as walking past, let your leg brush against some bark that's by a tree, or if you want to carry a pole, and the pole is going to be resting on your shoulder, and on your shoulder there's a lesion, and because of the pressure and the abrasion of the pole, that'll break off the lesion, since that is not a direct action of removal, but it's rather just a byproduct of your other action of either walking or carrying, so then that's perfectly fine. V'imavra avra, and if it's removed, it's removed.
With intention.
Even though it's your intention, even though you'd be very happy to have the lesion removed, but since your primary objective is not that, but rather just that you need to walk past something or you need to carry something, you're not. There's no prohibition for you to carry a pole on your shoulder, even if you know that in the course of carrying it on your shoulder, you may end up removing a lesion. So vaha lama likra. So the Gemara asks the question, what do you need a pasuk there either? Davar she'ein miskabin hu v'davar she'ein miskabin mutter. There, it's not your primary intent. Your primary intent is to walk or to carry a pole on your shoulder. So why shouldn't we automatically say it's mutter because of the principle that a davar she'ein miskabin is mutter? So Amar Rabbi lo nitzrach ela Rabbi Yehuda davar she'ein miskabin is aser. So here is where the discussion between Abai and Rabbi comes in. Abai says this brisa goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that even though it's a byproduct of your action and it's not your primary intention, it's still going to be aser. V'Rava Amar afilu tema Reb Shimon u'moder Reb Shimon b'psik reisha v'lo yamas. And Rabbi disagrees. He says, no, I hold that it even goes according to Reb Shimon that this would be aser without a pasuk, because if it's a psik reisha, that as a result of your abrasive action, you're going to be removing the lesion, and it's a psik reisha, so then even Reb Shimon would agree that it's aser. That's why you need the pasuk. Abaya Leslie Haisvar doesn't Abaya hold of that svar of psik reisha. The Habaya V'Rava Darmi to Ravaya Mod Reb Shimon psik reisha v'lo yamus. Don't we know that Abai and Rava both agree that Reb Shimon asers in a case of psik reisha? And says the Gemara, Labasa Deshame Me Rava Savra. After he heard Rava's argument, he assented to Rava's argument. So now the Gemara says, let's go back to our original version, which was that we were talking about a pasuk that permits me to do a bris on a foreskin with a lesion on it. And we had said that according to Abaye, you don't need a pasuk. That was at least Abaye's original thinking, that according to Reb Shimon, you don't need a pasuk to tell you that you're allowed to remove the foreskin because it's a davar she'eino miskabin, and a davar she'eino miskabin is mutter. So according to that line of reasoning, then what is the purpose of the word bisar in the pasuk? If the word bisar is not needed to tell me that I'm allowed to remove the foreskin, so then what is it there for if it's an extraneous word? Amar of Amram ba'omer lakutz baherto hu miskave. So answers the Gemara is that, let's say you're talking about a man who's about to circumcise himself, and he says, I know that I want to remove my foreskin, and I can't wait to remove my foreskin, and I also can't wait to remove the lesion that's on my foreskin. So he expresses his expressed desire to remove the lesion on his foreskin, so you can no longer say that it's a davar she'eino miskavin. And therefore, what the pasuk is needed for is that even in a scenario such as this, where a person verbalizes his desire to remove the lesion, it's still permitted for him to circumcise himself. So the Gemara says, Teinach gadol katan ma'ikal amemer. That's only going to work by the word bisar that's written in reference to an adult person who needs to be circumcised. But the Torah also talks about an infant who needs to remove his foreskin, and there the word bisar is also superfluous. And there you can't talk about the infant's intent. So Amar Rav Misharshia ba'Omer Avi Haben lakutz b'heres debino who kamich sorry ba'Omer Avi Haben lakutz b'heres debino who kamiskavin. Again, we're talking about a case where the father who's going to be performing the bris says, I can't wait to remove the lesion that's on my son's foreskin. So there too, he's expressing his desire, and therefore, since he's the one that's doing the excision, you need a pasuk to tell me that even when he's miskaving, even when his intention is to remove the lesion, it's still mutter. So the safrek the Gemara, but wait a minute, the ika acher li avid acher. But when you're dealing with a father who wants to remove his son's lesion, then we should not permit the father who expresses this desire to remove the lesion to perform the circumcision. We should hire a moil who doesn't care about the lesion and have him perform the bris. Because if a davar she'eino miskavin is mutter, why rely on a pasuk that's going to put you up against the mitzvah lo saseh of do not remove the lesion? So because the Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish kol makom she'ata motzei aseh v'lo saseh imata yachol l'kaim shnei mutav im lav yavo aseh v'yitcha lo saseh. Normally we say as follows: when we can avoid an opposition between a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah lo saseh, we should always choose that option. If we can do a mitzvah without being obligated to do an Aveira in the course of doing that mitzvah, then that's the path that we should choose. So if I have a choice of having either the father of the child do the bris with the express desire of removing the lesion, versus having a moil do the bris who doesn't care about the lesion, just wants to perform the circumcision, wouldn't it be better, says the Gemara, to hire someone who doesn't have the concern about the lesion, and in that way he won't be mamish being violating the isser of removing the neged saras, of removing the lesion, because you only, according to Reb Shimon, you only are in violation if that's your kavanah, if that's your intent. So isn't it always better to avoid trespassing on a mitzvah lo saseh, even when you're mandated to do it because of the mitzvah saseh? But it's always better to avoid that kind of oppositional situation.
But if there's no other...
So the Gemara answers, the leka acher, there is no one else available. That's the answer. When there's no one else available, you need a pasuk to tell me that even when the only person available to do the bris expresses his desire to remove the lesion, that's why you need the pasuk. Next, Amar Mar. So then the next part of the Brisa had said that Yom Tov eina docha elo bizmana bilvad, that a bris on Yom Tov, you can only override Yom Tov in order to justify doing the bris if it's the 8th day. But if it's past the 8th day, we do not allow you to do a bris even on Yom Tov. So minahani mili, where do we know this from? Omar Chizkiya v'chein tana devei Chizkiya, Omar Kra, lo sosiru mimenu ad boker, v'hanosar mimenu ad boker ba'esh tisrofu. That's the way you have to read the entire pasuk. The words ad boker do not leave over from the paschal sacrifice until the morning. And that which is left over until the morning shall be burnt in a fire. So the words ad boker are mentioned the second time superfluously. Why is it needed? Shein tamul amar ad boker, ma tamul amar ad boker, ba'akasav litein lo boker sheni, lisrei fasa. What the Torah is telling you is the reason it says until morning a second time is to tell you that when you burn it, you have to wait until the second morning in order to burn it. What does that mean? It means that you're not allowed to burn leftovers from a korban pesach on Yom Tov, because on Yom Tov you're only allowed to do malacha which pertains to those things which Hashem specifically says do them on Yom Tov. But there's no necessity to burn the leftovers from a korban pesach on Yom Tov. There's no requirement to do that. It's just Hashem wants you to dispose of the remains, but don't do that on Yom Tov. Leave it until the following day. And so basically you see from this whole concept that anything that's not mandated specifically for Yom Tov cannot be done on Yom Tov. Since a bris shelo bizmana, that's not on the 8th day, is not mandated specifically for this day, it's the same principle. Don't do it on Yom Tov, wait until tomorrow. Abaya says, I have a different pasuk. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Olas Shabbos b'Shabbato, velo Olas Chol b'Shabbos, velo Olas Chol b'Yom Tov. The Torah only permits me to bring the Olah of Shabbos on its Sabbath, but we are not permitted to bring a weekday korban on the Sabbath or a weekday korban on the Yom Tov. That's what I learned from Olah Shabbos b'Shabbato. And therefore, just like I can't bring a weekday korban on Yom Tov because it's not mandated for that day, so too I cannot perform a bris shelo bizmana, a non-8th day bris, because it's not mandated on that day. Rava Omar Kra Hu Levado Ye Aseh Lachem. Rabbi learns it out from a third pasuk. The pasuk says, when it talks about meleches ochel nefesh, that on Yom Tov you're allowed to do preparatory actions to prepare food. So the Torah says that only that which is for food purposes, that alone may be done for you. So hu velo machshirin levado velo mila. We learn from the extra word hu that even though you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to do the pre-cooking stages of preparation on Yom Tov. For example, you can't take kernels of wheat and grind them into flour on Yom Tov. That you're not allowed to do, but because that doesn't compromise the quality of the bread. But what you are allowed to do is you're allowed to bake on Yom Tov. You just can't do the preparatory stages before the cooking process. So that's what I learned from the word hu, and from the extra word levado. That alone, what does the word alone mean? That I'm not allowed to do bris milah on Yom Tov. He learns it from that pasuk. V'lo milah shelo bizman, excuse me. And da'asya mikal v'chomer. So the Gemara just points out that without the pasuk, says Rava, I would have thought that a bris milah is dochi Yom Tov. Why? So let's go over the kal v'chomer that we learned yesterday. Bris milah trumps saras. That we've already explained, right? And then we said yesterday that saras trumps avoda, which means that if a kohen has a lesion, he cannot remove the lesion in order to do the avoda, in order to bring a korban. Avoda trumps Shabbos. You're allowed to bring a korban on Shabbos, so you make a kal v'chomer. If tsaras trumps avoda and avoda trumps Shabbos, then bris milah, which trumps tsaras, should surely trump Shabbos and Yom Tov. So comes along the pasuk, Rava says no, that if it's milah shelo bismanav, that if it's not on the 8th day, it does not trump Yom Tov. Ravashi Omar Shabbason Asehu V'Havala Yom Tov Aseh V'Los Aseh V'Ein Aseh Doches Los Aseh V'Aseh. Ravashi gives the final answer, and his answer is as follows. Normally, you would argue that you don't need a pasuk at all, because you would argue as follows: let me do a bris, even if it's not on the 8th day, because there's a mitzvah saseh to do a bris at any time, even when it's not on the 8th day. And you apply the principle of aseh dochelos aseh, that a positive commandment overrides the negative commandment. The negative commandment is you shall not do work on Yom Tov. Yeah, but says Ravashi, no, you can't apply that principle, because Yom Tov is not just a mitzvah aseh, but it's a mitzvah aseh and a mitzvah los aseh. It's both a positive and a negative commandment. So why? Because the Torah says don't do malacha on Yom Tov, but it also says rest on Yom Tov, Shabbason. It shall be a day of rest. And so therefore a positive commandment of bris milah cannot trump an aseh and a los aseh together, and that's how I know that as long as it's not on the 8th day itself, you may not do a bris on Yom Tov. If it's on the 8th day, of course, then we had the words, the pasuk uvayom hashmini. On the 8th day, unconditionally, you shall perform the bris. Next, klal omer Rabbi Akiva v'chulei. We go back to our Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva had said a general rule. And that general rule was that anything that could be done before Yom Tov as a preparatory act for the bris milah, you cannot do on Shabbos. Only the things that are necessary on Shabbos can be done on Shabbos. And that's a disagreement with Rabbi Eliezer. And Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav halacha ka Rabbi Akiva. And that's how we paskin, says Rav Yehuda. Utzna nomi gabi Pesach ki hagavna klal Amar Rabbi Akiva kol malacha shef shelo la'asos l'me'erev Shabbos ena doches ha-Shabbos. Shchita she'ef shelo la'asos l'me'erev Shabbos doches ha-Shabbos. That Rabbi Akiva said the same principle by the laws of Korban Pesach. He said that anything that could be done in a preparatory fashion before Shabbos that will not compromise the Korban must be done before Shabbos. And this is when we're talking about when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, and you have to bring the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. He says, but Shchita, which can only be done on the 14th, that does override Shabbos. Rav Yehuda Amar Rav halacha ka Rabbi Akiva. And that's, again, Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav that we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. Utzricha. Why does Rab have to say it in both places that we paskin like Rabbi Akiva? Gabi Mila, because if we only learned this halacha, that the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva by bris milah, hasamhu demachshirin efshel la'asos and me'esmol lo dachu Shabbos deleka kares. Only over there do we say that the preparatory acts that could be done before Shabbos do not override Shabbos, because there's no kares involved. Because what are we talking about? We're talking about doing a bris on the 8th day for an infant. If a father neglects to do the bris on the 8th day, the father does not get kares. The only time a person gets kares for non-performance of bris milah is if he himself is an adult and he doesn't give himself a bris. But if a father neglects to circumcise his son, neither the son, who's not a bar onshin yet, he's not old enough to be punishable, nor the father will get kares, and therefore maybe only in that scenario do we hold of this principle that the machshirin are not docha Shabbos. Aval Pesach the kares ema litchu Shabbos. But maybe by Korban Pesach, that if I don't bring the Korban Pesach, I'm going to get kares, then maybe I can even do the machshirin, and that overrides. Gabe Pesach mishum delo nichrusu alei gimel brisos. Aval mila de nichrusu alei gimel brisos ema litchu Shabbos tzricha. And conversely, if I only said the halachas like Rabbi Akiva in regard to the Korban Pesach, maybe I could have argued that it's different by bris milah, because by bris milah the Torah writes the word bris 13 distinct times to tell me that God made 13 special contractual covenants with Avraham Avinu and his future descendants to necessitate the mitzvah of bris milah. And maybe there's a more compelling argument that even the machshirin would be doche Shabbos, and comes along therefore Rav to say no, in both by bris milah and by Korban Pesach we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Osin kol tzarchei milah b'Shabbos. This is a very important Mishnah, and it has very practical ramifications, and it's in the news a lot today. We are allowed to perform all the needs of the bris on Shabbos. Now, this is even according to Rabbi Akiva. This is talking about the things that can only be done on Shabbos. So what are they? Mo'alinu, poranu, motzitzin, v'nosman le, ispalonis, uchamon. That we do the excision of the foreskin. We do the lateral tear of the laminus mucosal membrane, which is the membrane that is beneath the foreskin. You have to tear it laterally, do a dorsal slit in order to be able to make sure that that membrane rests below the corona of the penis. The corona is the ridge that is directly below the glans or the head of the penis. You have to expose the head, the glans, completely in order for it to be a kosher meal. And then finally, umotzitzin, we do a suction. Suctioning in the times of the Mishnah was done through oral suctioning, by sucking with the mouth. And v'noskan aleha ispalana suchamon, and then afterwards we place a bandage and cumin powder, which had medicinal benefits known to the Mishnah. Imlo shachak me'erev Shabbos, however, if a person neglected to grind the powder from the cumin before Shabbos, lo eis b'shino v'nose, then we don't allow him to grind it on Shabbos in the normative fashion, but he can chew it in his mouth and grind it in, or chew it, grinding it by chewing, and then he can apply it. Obviously, the Mishnah doesn't reckon with bacteria. Although, as someone mentioned, elsewhere Chazal believe that the saliva has curative powers to it, and therefore maybe that's why it's okay. That if another thing that they used to use that was used as a medicinal cure was that they would take wine and oil and stir them vigorously together and then apply it to the wound. If you neglected to stir them together before Shabbos, we don't allow you to stir them vigorously on Shabbos, and instead you have to apply each one separately. Furthermore, you're not allowed to make a sleeve for the penis in order for it to heal properly. What they would do is they would apply a pressure sleeve to the wound in order to prevent the mucosal tissue and the remaining foreskin tissue to push itself back up and cover the glands. So it was basically a sleeve that would hold the tissue beneath the glands in order for it to heal properly. That you're not allowed to do on Shabbos, but you are allowed to wrap around it a bandage or a rag in this instance. And if you neglected to have it there at the before Shabbos, then you can wear it around your finger and then transport it while wearing it from one courtyard to another. It's mashma from the Mishnah that it's only from one carmelist to another, but not through mamash or rishus harabim. So we'll have to discuss that. But let's go back to the Gemara. Kuflu lamed gimel of a beis mechte. Ketani kulu kol tzarchei mila la'asuyei mai. If you already told me all the things that are necessary to do for a bris, then why did the Mishnah also have to say the generic statement of you can do all of the needs for a bris? You already told me what you can do. So the Gemara says, La'asuyi hadatana rabbanan is coming to include the following brisa. All kol zman shu osek b'mila choser ben al tzitzitzin ha'ma'akvin es amila ben al tzitzin shein ma'akvin es amila. That, if a moil is involved in the actual circumcision, he's still holding the scissors or the scalpel, removing the skin. And before he puts down the scalpel, he realizes, you know what? I think that there's more skin for me to take off. So he's allowed to continue cutting on Shabbos, and that's true regardless of whether the remaining skin invalidates the bris, or whether the remaining skin he only wants to remove for cosmetic reasons in order for it to heal nicely. In both situations, since he's still holding the scalpel and actively involved in the circumcision, he can continue cutting. In other words, where he's not rejoined against, to only do a minimal amount of cutting. Once you start cutting, you can finish the job completely. But piresh al tzitzin hama'akvenes amila choser, al tzitzin shein ma'akvenes amila eno choser. But let's say he finishes cutting, he puts down the scalpel, starts doing other things, preparing the bandage, whatever, and then he says, you know what, I'm not so happy with the way it looks, I want to take a little bit more skin off. So the halacha is as follows. We're talking about Shabbos now. If his assessment of the situation is that the remaining folds of skin are going to invalidate the bris because he assesses that the majority of the corona is still covered in foreskin, so then he's allowed to go back and continue cutting. But if his assessment is such that no, this is a kosher bris as it is, but I'm not so happy with the cosmetic result. I want to do a little fixing, right? I want a little nip and tucking, right? So then the halacha is that he's not allowed to because he's finished the mitzvah. And we don't give him the right just to do cosmetic surgery on Shabbos. That's what the Bryce is telling me. So therefore, the chiddush of our Mishnah is telling me that as long as the moil has not put down the scalpel, he's allowed to continue the cosmetic improvements of the bris. That's what we say, that you're allowed to do all of the tzarchei milah on Shabbos. Yes?
I just thought cosmetic necessarily apply. Maybe you might want to do it for a technical reason. It might not heal as well if there's a rough edge or something. Would that be a factor?
Well, what does that mean it's not going to heal well? The entire penis is elastic. So not healing well can only be cosmetically it's not going to heal well. What other issues are there? I mean, unless you can come up with an idea, unless you want to say that part of it may attach, and so that when he has an erection it'll be painful, that's also a possibility. I'm willing to acknowledge that, but we'll see that the Gemara seems to reckon mostly with the cosmetic issue, as you'll see in just a moment. So now the Gemara says, Man Tana Piresh Eno Choser. So who is the Tana who says that once you've already put the scalpel or the scissors down, you're not allowed to go back and continue cutting? For tzitzim she'ena ma'akvim, for strands of tissue that do not invalidate the bris. Amar Rabba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Yochanan ben Barokai. It's this Rabbi Yishmael who holds this way. The Tanya, and I can prove it because the Brisa says, Arba asar shechalios b'Shabbos, mafshid ha'pesach al hechaza div Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Yochanan ben Barokai, v'chachamim omrim mafshitin es kula. We have this machlokes that when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, we are limited in as far as how much work we're allowed to do in order to do the avoda of the Korban Pesach. According to Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Yochanan ben Baroka, you are allowed to flay the animal's hide of the freshly slaughtered lamb, but only up until the chest, which is where you're going to make the slit in its torso in order to remove the innards to place on the mizbeach. Once you've gotten the skin up until that point and you can make your slit and successfully remove the innards, you're not allowed to flay the animal any further. So Rashi just clarifies the reason for this is because that's there's a normal interval or pause at that point in the process of flaying. You flay the animal up until that point, up until the chest, you remove the innards, and then you do other things with the head and the feet of the animal, and then normally you continue flaying it after that. But since you've had a pause in the flaying process, according to Rabbi Yishmael, you're not allowed to continue flaying it beyond that. And it's the same principle over here. Once you've made a pause and you've put down the scalpel, you're not allowed to resume because you've already fulfilled the mitzvah. It's already done. So the Gemara says, Mimai. How do you see, and by the way, the Chachamim argue with Rabbi Yishmael over there. So the Gemara says, no, Mimai. Ad kan lo kamer Rabbi Yishmael ben Osher Yochanan ben Baroka hasan ela mishum de lo ba'inan zakei li b'anveyu. Aval hacha de ba'inan zakei li b'anveyu hachanami. The Gemara says maybe that's not necessarily so. Maybe Rabbi Yishmael only holds over there that you're not allowed to continue flaying the animal's hide, because there, once you've removed the innards and have all the materials that you need to put on the mizbeach, the remnant of the animal carcass is no longer going to be used for sacrificial purposes, and therefore there's no longer the principle of Zekei Li V'Anveyu, this is my Lord, and I shall glorify him, because you're not glorifying Hashem with the carcass anymore. Right? But in a case of bris milah, where we would apply the principle of this is my Lord and I shall glorify him, meaning that you're supposed to do the mitzvah in the optimal fashion and make it look cosmetically appealing, maybe even Rabbi Yishmael would agree that you're allowed to go back and fix the appearance of the circumcision so that it heals nicely and has a cosmetically nice appearance. The Tanya, as the Brisa says, Zekei li v'anveyu, hisnoa lefonav b'mitzvahs. The Torah says, this is my Lord and I shall glorify him. This teaches me that you're supposed to beautify yourself in the way that you do mitzvahs. Aseh lefonav sukkah no'eh, v'lulav no'eh, v'shofar no'eh, tzitzis no'eh, sefer Torah no'eh, v'chsof bo lishmo b'dyo no'eh, b'kulmus no'eh, b'lavlor umon, v'karcho b'shirai no'eh. The Brisa says that what are examples of these things? Make a beautiful sukkah, buy a beautiful lulav, blow a beautiful shofar, wear a beautiful talis, write a beautiful sefer Torah, use beautiful ink, use a scribe who has beautiful handwriting, and wrap the sefer Torah in beautiful mantelach. So you see that there's this concept of aesthetics as far as an important component of the mitzvah. So since there are aesthetics involved in the repair of the bris milah, maybe Rabbi Yishmael would agree that it's permitted over there. But there's no aesthetics involved in the flaying of the hide, and therefore maybe that's the reason why Rabbi Yishmael is more machmir over there. Abba Shol Omer, and the Brisa just continues, and it says there's another opinion on what Zekeli Ve'anvehu means. What does it mean? Ve'anvehu. Ve'anvehu, Rashi says, is a contraction of the words ani v'hu, that God and I are the same, which means havidomelo mahu chanun v'rachum afatah yechanun v'rachum, that you're supposed to say to yourself that just like God is benevolent and merciful, so too shall I be benevolent and merciful. That's what he learns. But the point is, at least according to the Tanakama, Zekeli V'anvehu applies by bris milah. It doesn't apply by the carcass of the Korban Pesach. Ela Amar Ravashi Hamani Rabbi Yossi. So Ravashi rather concludes that our Mishnah goes according to, or the Brisa that we're talking about goes according to Rabbi Yossi. Ditnan vein shenira ba'alil uvein shalom nira ba'alil mechalel and alavis hashabbos. And Rabbi Yossi Omer nira ba'alil ein mechalel and alavis hashabbos. There's a machlokus as follows. When it comes to the sanctification of the new moon, the Mishnah says that anyone who sees the new moon is allowed to be Mechalel Shabbos, to travel outside the Tchum in order to testify to Beis Din that the new moon has been sighted. So the Tanakama says this is true, that I, as a person who's seen the new moon last night, am allowed to be Mechalel Shabbos, regardless of whether the moon is just very, very clear. So I can assume that someone in Yerushalayim has already seen it, or whether it was obscure, and therefore I have to be concerned that if I don't come to testify, the Beis Din won't know about it. Either way, I'm allowed to be Mechalel Shabbos, and Rabbi Yossi disagrees, and Rabbi Yossi says no. Only if Hashem needs you, or the Jewish people need you, are you allowed to be Mechalel Shabbos. But if you're no longer needed for the mitzvah because someone else will testify, then you're not allowed to be Mechalel Shabbos. So the Gemara wants to say the same principle applies over here. Since you've already fulfilled the mitzvah, then you're no longer allowed to go back for the tzitzim she'ena ma'akvim. You can't go back and remove the folds of skin because those are not necessary for the fulfillment of the mitzvah. In the same way that Rabbi Yossi says you're not allowed to be Mechalel Shabbos when you're not needed for the mitzvah. So the Gemara says, "Mimai." What's the comparison? Dilma ad kan lo kamer Rabbi Yossi hasam ela delo nitna shaba litchos aval hacha de nitna shabbos litchos hachanami. The Gemara says there's a very important conceptual difference. When I was first given permission to do the bris, Hashem told me to be Mechalel Shabbos to do the bris. So I started off with a complete heter to go ahead and be Mechalel Shabbos. Maybe in that situation, Rav Yossi would agree that I'm allowed to continue even after I've already fulfilled the mitzvah, since I've already been given the carte blanche to go be Mechalel Shabbos. But in a situation of the sighting of the new moon, I haven't been given a mandate to be Mechalel Shabbos. I'm only given the mandate, says Rav Yossi, when I'm the only one who's going to be able to sanctify the new moon. But if not, I don't even start off with the heter of being Mechalel Shabbos, and that's where Rav Yossi says you have to be more machmir. So that can't be who the Mishnah goes like. So Ella Amri Nahardoi Rabbanan Depligile de Rav Yossi. Really, there's another Mishnah where there's a machlokus between the Chachamim and Rav Yossi on the following. Ditnan Arba'a Kohanim Nichnasim Shnayim Biyadam Shnei Sedarim Ushnayim Biyadam Shnei Bezichim the Arba'a Makdiim and Lifneihem Shnayim Litol Shnei Sedarim Ushnayim Litol Shnei Bezichim. The Gemara, the Mishnah rather, describes how the shtei halechem, the loaves, how the lechem hapanim, how the showbread from the showbread table was replaced on a weekly basis. Every Shabbos they would take off the old loaves of 12 loaves of bread, and they would replace them with the newly baked loaves of bread that were baked every Erev Shabbos. And the way that it would work is that you'd have 4 kohanim that would walk into the heichal. 2 went in order to remove. You had 2 sets of 4. Right. 4 kohanim went in to remove. They would take off two kohanim. Each one would take 6 loaves of bread, and the other 2 kohanim would remove the 2 spoons of frankincense that were resting on top of the showbread table. Following them would be another 4 kohanim. 2 of them would have the 6 loaves each of the newly baked bread, and 2 of them would have the 2 spoons of frankincense. The people who were in charge of putting on the new bread, they would stand on the north side, meaning that if you were looking at the showbread table straight ahead, you'd see the kohanim with the new bread on the right side of the table, and elu moshchim ve'elu manichim, tfachos shel zeh betzad tfachos shel zeh. And then the guys who were removing the old bread would be standing in the south. You'd look at them. They'd look at you on the left side, facing the showbread table. And as the Kohanim removing the old stuff were removing it, the new Kohanim were inserting on, so that at no point was the showbread table empty. They would slide off, and they would slide off the old, while the new ones were sliding on the new. And this is Mishum Shenamar, because it says in the Pasuk, Lefanai Tamid, you have to make sure that the bread is in front of me at all times. So Rabbi Yossi Omer, Afilu Elu Notlin, Ve'elu Manichin, Afzeh Hayat Tamid. And Rabbi Yossi disagrees. Rabbi Yossi says that no, the word Tamid constantly means that there cannot be any long intervals of no bread on the table. But if a few minutes go by that the Kohanim took off the old bread, and then you wait a few seconds and you put on the new bread, that's still called Tamid. That's still called constant. So this is the Machlokes, explains the Gemara, that according to the Chachamim who disagree with Rabbi Yossi, if there's any interval of interruption whatsoever, that's it. That's called an interval, and game is over. And the same principle is true by bris milah. Once I put the scalpel down, I've stopped doing the mitzvah, that there's an interval that's been created, and the mitzvah is over. If there's still remaining skin, as long as it's not necessary for the mitzvah, I'm not allowed to go back and start cutting. Rabbi Yossi disagrees, of course, and Rabbi Yossi says no, it's still considered to be part and parcel of the continuation of the milah, even if there's a small pause. Anyway, let us go on. Tona Rabbanan, Mahalkatin Asamila Vim Lo Hilket Anush Kares. The Brisa says that you excise the foreskin, and if you did not excise it, you get the punishment of kares. So the Gemara asks the question, money. Who is this Brisa going according to? Amar of Kahana. Not really who's it going according to, but who is it speaking about? Who is the person who gets kares? So Amar of Kahana, Uma. He says that it's the moil himself who's going to get kares. The moil himself is going to get kares. Why? Because we're talking about a moil who's doing a bris on Shabbos, and if he doesn't remove the entire foreskin, and he only removes a portion of the foreskin, he hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah, and yet he's done a malacha of doing a chabura on Shabbos, so he's going to get kares because he did a malacha on Shabbos without doing the bris. So maskef la Rav Papa uman leimalahu ana avdi palga the mitzvah atun avdisu palga the mitzvah. But why should that be? Why can't he say, look, I started off doing the mitzvah, I did half of it, you guys finish it? Who's to say that the mitzvah of bris milah can only be done by one person? Maybe let one moil do the first half and another will do the second half. And both of them are perfectly justified to do an act of chabura because they're in the process of doing a bris milah. So why should he get kares? So answers the Gemara, you're right. Ela Amar of Papa Gadol. What we're talking about is an adult who's giving himself his own bris. And we know that an adult who doesn't circumcise himself gets the punishment of kares. And we're not talking about Shabbos, we're just saying that an adult has to excise his foreskin, and if he doesn't, he gets kares. Plain and simple, he gets kares for what? For non-performance of bris milah. So maskef la Ravashi gadol behedjiksiv beva ariel zachar shelo yimo. He says, what do you need the Brisa to tell me that? The Torah itself says that if you don't circumcise yourself as an adult, you get kares. So you don't need a Brisa to tell me that. So Ela Amar Ravashi la'olam uman uchagon da'asa ben ashmashos de Shabbos v'amar lei lo maspikas v'amar lahu maspikina v'aved v'lo istapik v'ishtakach d'chabur hu da'aved v'anish kares. So Ravashi says it's as follows. We're talking about a moil. We're talking about a cowboy moil, right? He drives up in his motorcycle right before on Erev Shabbos to do a bris, and he comes and it's like 2 minutes before Shkia. And he says, where's the baby? Here's the baby. He says, come on, let's go ahead and do the bris. They say, you're not going to have time to do the bris. By the time you get ready and everything gets set up, it's going to be Shabbos already. He says, I got plenty of time because I'm a cowboy moil. Right? So he pulls out his knife and he starts cutting, and all of a sudden it's Shabbos. So it turns out, since there's no mitzvah of bris milah at nighttime, and now it's nighttime and it's Friday night and it's Shabbos, so he's done a chabura on Shabbos shelo b'makom mitzvah without doing the mitzvah, and therefore he's going to get kares for that. That's what the case is that we're talking about. Let's go on. Finally, we just got to do this. It'll take us another 2 minutes. This is a very important halacha that we're about to learn about mitzitza. Now, it's important to know that when the Mishnah was talking about mitzitza, they were talking about mitzitza b'peh. That was the only method of suctioning that was known in the times of the Mishnah. It was the only kind of suctioning that was available in the times of the Mishnah. There were no suctioning devices. There were no glass tubes and so forth. So this was the way that you removed the blood. And the question is, what's the purpose of the mitzitza? So, Amar Rav Papa, hay umna de lo mayit sakanahu va'avrinon lei. Any moil who does not do mitzitza is fired from his position because he's endangered the child's life. This has many important ramifications in halacha today about mitzitza b'peh. We don't have time to go into it. See my article from 2009 in Jewish Action, 2010 I think, no 2009, something like that, in Jewish Action on mitzitza b'peh. Anyway, so it's a sakana, and v'avrinan lei, and we remove him from his post. So pshita midakam mechalali aleha shabsa sakanahu. So the Gemara says, isn't that obvious that it's sakana? If you're allowed to be mechalal Shabbos in order to perform mitzitza, it must mean that it's necessary to do it. Now, what do you see from this Gemara? You see from this Gemara that it's not an integral part of the mitzvah. If it were an integral part of the mitzvah, then the Gemara would say, well, if it's an integral part of the mitzvah, that's why the Torah says yimo. You're allowed to do it on Shabbos. It's not. It's because it's a sakana. You've already fulfilled the mitzvah of bris milah, and you're allowed to do mitzitza because if you don't, it's a sakana to the child. So the Gemara says no. Mahu de tema hai dam mifked pakid kamash balon chibure michbar v'dumi dispalon esuchamon. So the Gemara says no. You might have thought that the reason why the Mishnah permits you to do mitzitza is because there's no malacha involved. Why? Because the only time there's a malacha in drawing blood is if you squeeze out blood from tissue. But let's say there's a pocket of blood and you just rupture the skin that is above the blood, and the blood just flows out, and you cause the blood to flow out by suctioning it out. You haven't done a malacha. So you might have thought that the blood is in a pocket that's beneath the foreskin, and it's not absorbed in the tissue, and that's why you're allowed to do mitzitza because there's no malach involved, not because there's a sakana. So therefore, comes along the Gemara to tell you, no, that it's just like cumin powder and a bandage. Just like there's a need to apply a bandage and cumin powder because if not, you're endangering the life of the child, so too you need to do mitzitza because if not, you're endangering the life of the child. And finally, v'nosn alav yispalanis, you're allowed to put a bandage on the child on Shabbos. Amar Abaya, Amar li'aim, ispalnisa de kulon kibi, shev minoi tarba v'chada kira. My mother told me that the most effective ispalanis, effective bandage, is called kibi. I'm not sure, I think that's just the word that he used to call it. And what is the definition of a kibi bandage? It's 7 parts fat and 1 part wax. It's a type of salve that you apply, not really a bandage, but really a salve that is placed over the tissue in order to heal it. Rava Amar Kira V'Kalba Rishina. Rava says no. The recipe is wax and tree sap, a certain kind of white tree sap that when you mix it, it acts as some kind of I forget the word I'm looking for, but anyway, it acts for medicinal purposes. Darsha Rava b'Machuza Karinu b'nei Minyumi Asa Limonayu. Rava gave out the recipe of this salve in the city of Machuza. And the b'nei Minyumi Asya, these people who were the physicians of the city, they tore their garments. You know why, Dan? Because they were going to lose their parnasa. They had the secret to sports medicine.
I'd be ecstatic.
So they tore their clothes. They said, a trade secret like that, we were making millions of dollars from selling this amazing secret recipe, and now Rava gave away the recipe. Now we're not going to make any money anymore. So Amar Lahu, Shavka Lahu Chada, the Amar Shmuel, Haiman de Mashi Ape, Velono Giv Tuva, Naktiru Lechas Benisa. My takante limshi tuva b'maya de silka. So Rava said to them, look, don't feel so bad. I left one trade secret that I haven't revealed. There's one secret that you still have that people will need to go to you for, and that is as follows. If a person washes his face and doesn't dry it properly, he'll develop fissures and cracks in his skin, which could be very painful and very not nice. So what's the remedy? Rava did not reveal the remedy, but the Gemara reveals the remedy. What is it? He should use beet water, like borscht, and wash his face in borscht. You may look a little red, but you'll feel a lot better. Have a wonderful day.